You guys have
So,
made such great progress and so quickly. It's been great.
so we'll get started and just kind of go slow here. I'll share just kind of the overall results from round three. Please let me know if you have any questions as we go through them. We added quite a few elements, so it was great to see us reach quite a level of consensus here in the third round. As always, recording, and then I'll be sure to send out this slide deck right after for you all to review. So first we'll go through round three results, overall results, and then we'll get into kind of some specifics. And then kind of the next step of the project is now putting our recommendations into a white paper form so we can officially submit those recommendations to the CDE steering committee. So first of all, round three results. I have rounds one through three displayed here. We can see that in each round, right, we've gone higher in what's reached consensus both in inclusion and exclusion. So quite a jump here at the end. We had a grand total of 43 elements reach inclusion, consensus for inclusion. And then we also had quite a bit of consensus jump here in exclusion. So just elements that the group knew that we didn't want to adopt. And then we had just a handful of elements here, a little bit less than 30% of the elements that just did not reach consensus. That's to be expected because we had specifically some topics that had multiple elements. We wouldn't want to be adopting all of the elements that were provided to you guys. So totally makes sense that we have some left over. I'm going to go through these groupings that we've been working with based off of the NINS SDOH determinant structure. So first looking at the structural determinants, those that are bolded were added in round three. Those that are not bolded, were approved in some previous round. So you can see that, and last month we talked about housing quite a bit. So last month we had a discussion and determined to go ahead with the two existing Fitberg CDEs. And then in this third round, we had two new housing slash homelessness elements reach consensus. One of those being from study track TBI, and then another one being from the Prepare questionnaire. I will let you all know now that the entire Prepare toolkit was adopted. So that entire toolkit will be, all the elements from that will be adopted. So now it's kind of a matter of what we can have a discussion in a few minutes, whether this new track TBI specific housing and homelessness question, adds some value to the two that we've already looked at. And then we finally added an immigration status from Loink that was, I believe, included starting in round two. Looking at social status determinants, same thing, bolded ones were added in this particular third round. We added HRSA's area deprivation index relating to geography. As a reminder, all the other geographic units down to zip code have already been adopted in the system. We haven't gone any deeper than that, and the FitBER system doesn't recommend going any deeper than zip code, but those have all been adopted as of today. We also added employment, occupation, race and ethnicity. We added another incarceration element, and then as well as a veteran status element. Intermediate determinants, this is kind of the largest group. We had quite a bit of consensus from this grouping over the first two rounds, so you can see that we've just added a couple of new ones. One being a transportation. The data element is difficulty with a transportation indicator, just kind of a yes, no question related to that. Neighborhood safety, a NIN specific element reached consensus, and then also another NIN specific element related to the type of emergency medical care provided in the pre-hospital environment. And then finally, we did add one new toolkit. The Health Lead Screening Toolkit reached consensus in round three. Prepare, as I mentioned earlier, reached consensus in round two, so that entire toolkit will be adopted. So eventually what I'll do right now and for these slides, it's just kind of what was the topic and what was the source and what was the major data element. What I will do kind of in the next steps is provide this with much more detail of the definitions, the permissible values for every single one of these elements. So we'll have a single table that will have every single element that this group is recommending for inclusion in the NTRR with a lot more specifics. Moving forward, there were a couple of elements that I think we should take some time to discuss today. Not too many, thankfully, but we can go through these one at a time. I'll give you kind of some background on what we need to discuss and decide, and then get the group's feedback. So first is housing and homelessness. So first of all, this top element with the asterisk, this element has already been adopted from a previous working group. So a previous working group has recommended this top residence type element here at the top. Last month, we did discuss housing and homelessness because there were actually three other elements that reached consensus from round two. So we had quite a discussion about that, and it was determined that the group would like to adopt this top element that's already been adopted, as well as this secondary element, living situation before injury, which, as we can see when it comes to the permissible values, is quite distinct between the two. Um, so these two have been, prior to today, have been recommended by this group. But then in round three, we did have these two additional elements that reached consensus. As I've said, this entire prepare questionnaire is going to get adopted, so we don't really need to look at this element specifically. It's really this track TBI element here called living situation. So if you all could take a look at these permissible values and see, do we think that this provides, a different context to this question that provides value that the two other elements do not? And is it worth us adding a third, housing and homelessness element? Or would we like to backtrack and maybe change our recommendations in any way?
Thinking about it. I think I'm probably the one who suggested that variable, probably because I thought the fit for variable that had been previously recommended wasn't quite sufficient. I think there were a lot of variables where I think there was a previously recommended variable, but several of us made comments about ways we wanted to improve or change it, and then it
Mhm.
left us in a bind of, well, I don't think we can change it, so should we recommend something else? And so I'm kind of just circling around that thought right now. That I think there were things we didn't like about the fit beer variable, and in certain contexts, the track TBI variable does add more information, like whether the living situation has been affected by injury and that kind of thing. But obviously, it's a lot more complex as well. Hmm.
And I will say for existing Fitbit elements, we kind of have an option where we can recommend additional permissible values specifically for Fitbit elements. That's not to say that we'll necessarily get what we want, but this working group can, being the subject matter experts in these types of areas, we can make that recommendation, and then we can see whether that recommendation is taken or not. So we could always have like in an ideal world, we would like this, and if not, then, second option.
Hmm.
We can get down to those specifics if you all would like, and then what we'll do is we can write that up and then present it in that way.
I also don't like that the two fifth grade questions have different structure. One is current living and one is pre-injury living. If you're doing a study and you want to assess pre-injury living situation and current living situation, you would want to use the same options for both, right? So that's also awkward about all of this. I'm not sure what the easiest path forward is, but clearly, like the track TBI item might be more relevant for maybe an acute, subacute traumatic injury study where you're trying to sort of assess the impact of injury in a more fine-grained way. The pre-injury question is more about pre-injury. So these are for different contexts. So I don't know.
I would agree they're very different contexts, but I would think that they may often be different just because of the fact that some injury is going to really impact somebody's living situation and like where are they now, or if they're 6 months out from an injury and they're recovering, could have been a very different situation, and maybe even like how they came to be injured had something to do with what their living situation was. So I mean, I think it could be relevant to have both, and that they might be different, but I don't know which one should be more granular.
Yep, yep. And another thing that came up, I think, in a number of these is that some of these variables that were proposed are more amenable to a self-report checklist, and some are more amenable to an interview. And that came up with this as well, right? So if you were doing a questionnaire, you would probably want the simpler one on the top. And if you were interviewing patients and having the staff member code it, then the more detailed one might be preferred. So um, while I don't want to recommend a million different options, sometimes it's helpful to give people more options for different study contexts.
From my perspective, at this point, it sounds to me like the group would like to keep all in these three, and there's nothing I don't think wrong with us recommending this, and then taking it to CDE steering and saying, "Hey, here's the rationale for why we think that we should add another one." It is different. There is a different context, so these are our recommendations, and then and see what they think. So I think, does that sound good with everyone? Leave it in as a recommendation, add track TBI and these options.
Like that.
Yeah, I think that's appropriate.
All right. The second one was employment. We haven't really touched on employment quite yet. Let me slide this over. Um, we we kind of delved a little bit into it last month, just because there was a lot of feedback from the group. There were no elements that specifically reached consensus last in through round two, but there was a lot of comments for this particular element. So from the discussion from last meeting, we were specifically talking about this top element, which has already been recommended for adoption from another working group. And the main feedbacks were that keeping house is very dated, and that we would like to kind of rephrase that if we could, which I think is a great recommendation because on the back end, we could keep the output codes the same, but just update the actual text for how that would be answered. So I think that's a good recommendation, but I would like to hear how we would like to change that phrasing. And then we also discussed creating a new student status indicator. So essentially a student specific element, being a yes, no, are you currently a student, instead of grouping it here in employment, because you could be employed and a student. So that's where we kind of what we talked about last month. And then in round three, we now have a new element that did reach consensus, this NIH element. So if you all could take a moment or two and look at these kind of permissible values, now that we had an idea of what we wanted to do with this, and now how does this coming to reaching consensus maybe change what we would like to do with this element?
be easier if there was like a side by side so we could easily see what categories were different and the same about these two. I feel like we probably want to either adopt the NIH one or recommend revising the fifth year one. It's a little bit hard to see quickly the differences. The first one's more clearly about current employment. The bottom one is more vague. So could that be used as a pre-injury employment? I guess I'm also wondering if it is important to be clear and have a pre-injury employment and a current employment variable.
Maybe for this one, for the moment, I can put together a side by side, and we can really see what the distinctions are. I could kind of send that in the follow-up to today's meeting.
Yeah,
There's quite a
that'd be
bit of
super helpful.
PVs.
Yeah, and it'd be
Um,
helpful to see the comments that were made just to make sure we're accommodating what all the good ideas were about revisions.
yeah,
Or
absolutely.
maybe a proposed changes or something to start a starting point.
Sure. Let me see. Employment 5.
I do feel like the NIH one, I mean, I guess like the temporary laid off sick leave or maternity leave is a little bit more inclusive. And I like the working without pay as sort of an option, right, on that one. Um, and it has student. Um,
Yeah, they both have student.
oh yeah, the other one does have students here. I just missed that. You're
Yeah,
right. Sorry.
they both have temporary laid off sick and maternity, but the NIH one combines them.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's just like a lot of little differences that make it hard to sort of.
But they're also, I mean, I think that I'm not sure. I'm not sure about I don't know if they're that obviously temporally different. They both sort of read as like right now. And like description of the person's employment status, right? And so I think the current is implied because it doesn't say past. And so I do think yeah, we need one and they're almost exactly the same,
They're pretty close. Yeah,
right?
they're pretty close. Yeah.
And so, I mean, they both have keeping house, and I understand we don't love that, but it's also like, you know, the
Yeah.
other one, the NIH one at least has an alternative description.
And then
It just seems,
sorry, go
sorry.
ahead.
No, go ahead.
Just looking at feedback from the group and in the comments, recommendations for improving keeping house were either caregiver, unpaid labor. Other comments were expanding the wording on sick leave or maternity leave to be more encompassing. And then the other question was, this allowed for multiple options? And I actually need to check that. Let
I
me
think
pull
that's
that
a
up right
no.
now.
Yeah, I think it's a choose one, which means you have to pick your primary. And then maybe I think we had a separate variable that was just student status.
And student is on both of them, right? So am I
Mhm.
missing? Okay.
It
great.
is. Yeah, I think I don't love that it's there because people are often doing both.
Right.
Um, but
Well, yeah, it's like student and not working. Oh, like an additional question. I understand now. I was like,
yeah,
I
like
think I
your work
finally get it. Got it.
status and your student status
Student
would be
status. Okay.
more straightforward, I think. But
Yeah.
yeah, but some people identify this as their work role as being a student, so I kind of get it, but it can be kind of
And so
awkward.
maybe also just adding some clarification to what working without pay means and how it differentiates from like raising children,
Yeah, that sounds like volunteer work, right?
like
So
professional volunteers. Yeah.
yeah, and I don't know if it's important to have so many categories, honestly. I wonder if my gut is that if the fifth year one could just be modified, it might be fine. But like, yeah, seeing them side by side and seeing some suggestions would be probably helpful.
What I'll do is I'll put them side by side. I do have our kind of recommendations for editing Fitbur in terms of keeping house. Um, and then what we'll do is when I put them side by side, if you all have specific recommendations for editing Fitbur, as I said, we have the ability to recommend either changing just the verbiage that's used for a particular response or adding additional PVs if we feel like, NIH just has one or two that we think, should be included. Some of these elements that already exist haven't been looked at in quite some time. So we've seen that from the other work groups, and the other work groups have made recommendations, and then those recommendations have been taken and added. We've already had that happen quite a few times where there are holes that we're trying to fill in these existing elements. So I'll send it out. And then please, if you do have any more specifics, what I'm going to do for the moment is just keep our recommendations for, of course, creating a new student status indicator, since you can be a student and be employed. Another question I have for this group is if we would like to recommend Fitbur be a multi-select if that's possible, because it's currently, as Lynn said, as a single select, which has its downsides. And if that's something that we would like to recommend, or if you'd like to recommend that, maybe you just put that in your response when I send this particular element out to you guys. The next item is occupation. Comments really quickly on this one were mainly related to the use of elementary worker here in the Fitbur element. Once again, this being an element that's been recommended from a previous work group, and then now this is the first time that we've had an element that met consensus from this group. So I will say that the previous work group looked at both of these, and there was a lengthy discussion about which one to use. I'd have to go back to my notes to really determine which one, why they picked, one over the other. But this is kind of very similar where we have a million different options for the different occupations. This might be another one where it's worth me putting everything side by side and we can really see the differences in the permissible values that are unique to each one of these elements. And then I believe that was all of the comments. Let me pull up those comments for occupation. Other comments. So two comments relating to elementary worker and not appreciating that description of that type of work. And then other comments related to changing the ordering, which I'd have to actually ask if we can do that. I know a lot of times they're listed alphabetically, which doesn't always make things easy for everyone, but I believe that's a Fitbur standard when it comes to PVs, or they at least like to try to adhere to that standard.
I got really hung up on that in our first round because it looked so awkward. But then I realized I think that's just how it is in FitBeer. Doesn't mean your case report form can't lay it out in that sensible order, right? Like
That's
the
correct.
TBI common data element case report forms put them in a different order that makes more sense. So maybe we don't need to worry about order.
And then the other is kind of related back to the context that we've talked about before, which is specifying pre-injury. If this is a specific to pre-injury, then that means, well, if we wanted to collect that data after injury, but we'd have to have another element for that.
I don't know. I find it very challenging to categorize occupations and um, I don't know how. I can't think of a study that where it's been really important to do so. Old studies, we used to use the Hollingshead, whatever, socioeconomic status measure, and there was a way of categorizing jobs to actually quantify SES. But I don't know how these variables are even being used, if at all. So,
Do these match like the NIOSH designations? Because I have done studies of like, occupational cohorts where it does matter. You have sort of like primary, secondary, and all of these kinds of things. But usually people don't know that. And so you like take their job and then NIOSH has like a pretty good sort of like, you just compare, right? And say, okay, if you say you're an MA, they consider that this kind of like a nice little crosswalk. But I don't know how relevant it is here. But people might want to do like occupational cohorts. I'm assuming that there's potentially like on our like firefighter cohorts, right? Like if you want to know if they're a frontline worker versus, or I don't
right,
know. It seems like there
right.
might be useful for research.
I think so. I mean, in traumatic brain injury, I know people have talked about how people in higher level quote unquote jobs often have less impact of injury because their jobs are more flexible. They can afford them more, I don't know, remote work and different flexibility than like, a factory job or something. It is what it is. And there's not a lot of opportunity sometimes to be accommodated for injury impairment. So I just don't know. I don't know how those things are quantified. Or what the reliability is of a variable like this.
I just realized the time. I have to run to my department meeting. Thursdays afternoons are when we have all of our department meetings like back to back. So I can usually double dip, but I have to present at this one. So I'll follow up by email. Thanks all. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for joining. Appreciate your time. Would we like to just bump this up? Keep it here and see what the higher ups think?
Sure.
I think so.
Good.
Last one is race and ethnicity. We haven't talked about this one yet. So this is two elements that have already been recommended from previous work groups, one being ethnicity and one being race, existing FITBER elements, and then the new element that reached consensus is those two combined. Race and ethnicity, self-identification, NIH's definition source. So we can see here the PVs are slightly different. Of course, they're now combined with Hispanic, Latino is added in there. I believe the only other difference is the addition of Middle Eastern and North African. So this, we have received much feedback about the new OMB standards for adding Middle Eastern and North African. That's something that we've taken to the FITBER team already from a previous work group. They have said essentially that we want to hold tight for the moment because you never know with administrations changing is when they're just going to change it anyways. Back to something else. So they're kind of in a like let's hold steady with what we have and the way we've been collecting data for the moment in case nothing ends up getting changed, in which case we still have this, the data the way it's been collected will continue to be collected. in that fashion. So just some other context for this particular element for you
Well,
guys.
OMB was also going to combine race and ethnicity into one question, right?
Yes, correct.
Which honestly I think is a great idea because these two variables are highly correlated. And when you look at your data, you find like 98% of your white sample is identifies as non-Hispanic, and it just makes sense from a statistical standpoint to like collapse them together.
Mhm.
So I would
And then
support
just
that.
for a little bit more context for you all, the ethnicity is a single select, and fit for race is a multi-select, and then of course the NIH is a multi-select.
I hear Fitber's concern. I think the point of this is like the recommendation is we need to be considering OMB standards and trying to match the OMB standard as much as possible. Whether that means updating the Fitber elements or adopting a new element altogether, I don't know if that really matters as much.
Sure. Yeah. And if you collect ethnicity and race separately, you can combine them in the back end on your analysis. So it's not so important, and maybe it's good. I see the point of keeping consistent with conventions.
Any other thoughts on this one? I'll be sure to write down, when we can to adopt the OMB the way that it's being recommended. All right. So the next steps for this project are now putting together a white paper with these recommendations. As I said kind of at the beginning, so far I've just been essentially sharing with you all the list of what topic is this, where's the definition from, and what's just the name of the item. We've gotten a little bit deeper into some of these because they need this type of discussion. But what I'll be doing next is kind of drafting these recommendations in a more formal way with all the specifics for these elements. So that will include the methods that we've gone through to select these elements, as well as the results. So those results will be the data elements themselves, toolkits that met consensus for inclusion as well as exclusion. So those will be tables that you'll be able to look at them. Inclusion elements, exclusion elements, and then as well as some elements that did not reach consensus. As I've said, there will also be tables that include much more specifics about these data elements. So the definitions for them, the permissible values, as well as any type of input restrictions. So things like multi-select, single select. Is it free form entry, things like that. So essentially taking all the data that was actually on the Delphi plus a little bit more and incorporating that into the official recommendations. And then as we've talked about, and as we'll continue to look at some of these elements, is recommendations for editing already adopted CVEs. So whether that is us saying, hey, this other group has already adopted these, but we think we should add this one, or hey, is there any way we can change this existing element by changing the verbiage to be this? So we'll be writing out all of those. Dr. West, you have a question?
Yeah, has there been something? Is there a format for this white paper that you're talking about, and or is there a particular location that it's getting published? I can't, since we're only one of the groups, I can't imagine that is all kind of unique and it's never been.
Yeah, so the other four work groups, that's a great question. The other four work groups have submitted their recommendations in a formal document to the CDE steering committee who reviewed it, and then eventually it went to the executive steering committee for final approval. And then once that happens, that's when we can actually develop the elements in the system. So yes, there's a very standard way that these have been written. I can share with the group maybe one that's already been submitted. Epidemiology is probably the closest overlap. So it's not going to take, it shouldn't take very long because we already have kind of a template for how this data is going to be shared. This group is, of course, a little bit different because now we're dealing with kind of looking at elements that have already been recommended, whereas the other groups were all working independently at the same time. So there will be probably a little bit more an in-depth of a discussion when it comes to those topics. But yeah, we have a pretty standard way that these are being written. And the idea is that this white paper will just focus on the recommendations themselves for getting approval for creation in the NTRR. And then once we get them created, then we'll circle back and expand on the white paper for formal publication. We're still figuring out exactly where we're going to be doing that. Michelle, I believe you have a call tomorrow or coming up soon.
Actually, it's later today. Well, we have two things. So this afternoon, we are talking with Sharon Gauchi, the executive director of the AAST. Of course, many of you know that. They actually, kind of run both the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery and the Trauma Surgery Acute Care Open, which of course, Dr. West, you're on the editorial board of that, because we are thinking we want to have all of these papers submitted to the same place and published as some sort of a supplemental, perhaps, and definitely open access. And we know that TSACO has given us like a package price for supplementals with several articles in them, and we don't know if JTACS would consider that as well. But we're going to talk to her about that this afternoon. And then we're going to talk to executive NTRR exec tomorrow about what the options are. Now, I realize that there are other places that might be interested in publishing this as well. And so one thing we haven't delved into, but I was going to bring it up tomorrow with exec is, sometimes I've seen where certain journals will agree to all publish the same thing so that you get wide distribution, and it's attributed that way when it's published, that it's also in these other journals. Like when major recommendations come out from like the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, stuff like that. So, and obviously this is at that level, but I didn't know like if there might be, particular journals that you all think would also like to have your white paper in particular. So that's something to think about.
Michelle, one thing that when you're talking to Sharon, that JTACS, I'm also on that editorial board, but they have something where, in order to keep the name of Journal of Trauma, which in addition to Journal of Trauma and Acute Care, they have that. So they end up kind of publishing one thing that's open access under that moniker for some reason, and they're not so worried about the circulation. So that might be something else to just ask if this would be a very appropriate place for all of those kinds of things for the NTRR, because that is something that would be of interest to everybody that's kind of involved with trauma.
That is a good idea. I know that they have to do that in order to maintain that name so that no one can start publishing under
like once a year at least or something.
I wonder what the impact factor situation is, though. I mean, does JTACS promote those articles the same way they do JTACS articles, or how does that work?
I don't know that they promote it, but you could ask Sharon; she would probably know, because AAST kind of still owns JTACS, but that I think the thing was that it's open, and so it may not go into the denominator for impact factor, and therefore they may feel like they don't have to worry so much about whether that's getting cited. Actually, they may be happy because it might get cited a ton. So they may be very happy. Yeah, it should be.
You're right. Okay, thanks for that suggestion. We'll definitely bring that up with her too. And Smitty or Lynn, do you have any thoughts about whether there might be other journals that would be interested, like just in this SDOH article?
Nothing's springing to mind, but I'll think about it.
Okay. It would be like a co-publishing thing. And, I don't know, like I said, I don't know how sensitive that even is. But at least wherever we publish it, it'll be open. So anybody can get to it, and we can promote it among the circles that you guys tend to run in. I just want to make sure that the uptake is as broad as possible. And also the paper that will come out of your group will just be the authorship will be your group. And a little later, Nick will follow up with you and say, if you're interested in being a named co-author and you really want to be involved in the writing, let us know. Or if you just want to be part of the corporate author group, the SDOH working group, whatever that ends up. We haven't figured out exactly what those monikers are going to look like. But that's something else we'll ask you about. I mean, we typically what we've been assuming and what we've been seeing is that the panel leader is willing to take on the first author role and the heavy lift, the heaviest lift. And then some are interested in being a named participating author in the writing of it. And really the big thing to write up. I mean, we were talking about this in a group too, as the methods are going to be the same for every paper, just like when we did our National Trauma Research Action Plan. The methods were pretty much the same for every one of those Delphi panels, but it's the background section, the results, which will probably be structured the same for everyone, but of course, different items identified, and then the discussion, will be a little different. And you guys will have the benefit of trailing just slightly behind the other groups. And so you might be able to, even look at how they approach it. But it'll be a pretty formulaic group of papers, which is why we do want to publish them all together. So it doesn't look like we're trying to piecemeal it out. But the fact is, there's no way you could even if you did them all as appendices, like supplemental onlines, there's no way you could cover all these different items from these 5 work groups in one. So I think doing them as 5 is great. I think a journal will pick it up, but I'm open to any other thoughts about that.
Yeah, I don't think my journals I'm thinking of would be primary, but in traumatic brain injury, I think one of the more widely read journals is the Journal of Neurotrauma, and the papers that are coming out of the NINDS TBI classification initiative working groups, which are all under review right now, we're hoping they'll get into the Journal of Neurotrauma. One of them being my group was just on psychosocial environmental modifiers. So we'll see that, but I don't know what their open access fees are. They also have an open access sister journal called Neurotrauma Reports, but if there's some I'm not so familiar with that co-publishing concept, but if I think it's good to reach a traumatic brain injury research audience. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. And another option too, that we really haven't talked about with any of the groups is that maybe there are some work group members that would like to write a letter to the editor of the journals that you're talking about that says, this just recently was published. This is a new data resource. And that's another way of getting the word out, getting another pub for the people that work on those journal, letters to the editor. And they're pretty short, as Dr. West knows. She's done those before. So that's a thought too. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity here. I think we should maximize it. Right.
Good idea. Yeah. Maybe I could just tack on here. I don't want to hijack the conversation, but the NINS TBI CDE 3.0 project just got started. All the orientation meetings just happened. I'm leading the participant characteristics working group, which does have overlap to some of the variables we talked about in this project, including things like employment status and marital status and education and demographics. So we're going to be a little bit delayed behind this group since we just started, but the goal timeline is, I think, fairly tight. I think around 6 months to have, our CDEs determined. It's a different process. It's focused on traumatic brain injury and what's relevant in that area of research. But it'd be nice if we had some overlap between the outcomes and endpoints being proposed across these 2 initiatives. So I'm looking forward to the list you provide me with what we've currently recommended, because I can bring that back to this group and keep you posted on what that working group is wanting to recommend.
And the other thing you may already know is Ninsini Umo is on our exec committee. So we've got that direct NINS link. So hopefully everything is, marrying up and not being duplicated or contradictory.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think, yeah, other differences there. We're not doing the Delphi. But we're going to have a more express consideration of lifespan, which I don't think we really considered in this group, and a little bit more express consideration of different research contexts. But we're not doing the Delphi. So differences that could easily lead to some differences in the recommendations. So keep you posted.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
So I will begin working on this and the ideas in the next 2 weeks or so. I can get a draft out to everyone with all of this type of content. And then that way, before our next meeting, you all will have a little bit of time to review it and provide some feedback and comments. And then what we can do during our next meeting is then look at and discuss, y'all's thoughts, other ththings that we need to expand on. What were everyone's edits, comments for the white paper? See, maybe this is a working meeting where we get part of the way through it. Maybe we get all the way through it. We'll just have to kind of see where the white paper is at that point in time. There is another CDE steering committee that happens that week. So ideally, we get this to some form of state where we can kind of begin to share our formal recommendations with that group, or at least have an idea of which items need to get sent to them, because we need them to actually make the final call on which one of these options to go with. Other than that, I will follow up on the items that we touched on today. So breaking out those PVs for you guys, so that you can look side by side and maybe provide a little bit more specifics on what you guys are thinking. And then of course sending out the recording and then this slide deck for you all. Does anyone have any final questions for me about anything at all?
I'm just curious how much participation we got in the Delphi surveys. Can you remind me how many members were in this group and how many actually did the surveys?
Sure. Let me pull up all of the data here. We had what? We had 13 participating. We had Olga from FITBER as a member of the working group, as more of someone to consult for specific items, but she did not take the survey. We don't actually want her taking the survey. So we had 13 members who would actually be taking the survey. In this final round, let me pull up. In this final round, we had 10 take the survey. And then in round 2, I believe we had 12 of the 13.
Yeah, all right.
So pretty good. Pretty
Yeah.
good overall.
Very
Very
good.
happy with the participation numbers overall.
Yeah, I wish people made more comments. It was really hard to adapt my thinking over time because there weren't any comments to learn from what people were thinking.
For sure.
And people didn't really come to the meetings to talk about it. So I feel like that's a limitation that you might want to discuss.
Yeah, we can definitely add
Good
that
point.
to the discussion. But I appreciate all of those, all of you who did come to the meetings, because I feel like we did have a great discussion of those who attended. All right, well, that's all I have for you all today. I will be sure to follow up, and as always, please reach out if you have any questions, and looking forward to your feedback on those couple of items I'll send your way.
Thanks, Nick.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks.